Welcome to The Great Awakening. I'm your host, Josh Daws. My guest today is Brandon Showalter. He is a journalist for the Christian Post, where he has done a lot of excellent work reporting on the trans movement and a lot of the issues surrounding trans ideology from the various organizations that are pushing that into schools, targeting children with it, to the medical establishments that are performing just the most gruesome procedures on trans identifying individuals. It's really horrific, gruesome stuff. But I think, I wanted to have Brandon on to really help give kind of a human face to the culture war. I think a lot of times we engage in these battles and we can kind of take a pleasure in owning the libs, and we kind of forget the very real stakes to the culture war, that there are people, there are children that are being targeted by these evil ideologies. And as Christians, it's not just an optional thing that, it can be fun to engage in on the side if you're so inclined, but we have a real duty to speak up for the vulnerable, to, try and rescue as many kids as we can from this ideology that is just harming so many. And so Brandon's doing great work exposing that, bringing those works of darkness into the light. As just a fair warning on this episode, Brandon gets a little graphic with his descriptions of some of these surgical procedures that are done on these individuals. So just a fair warning, this might not be an episode you want to listen to with your kids, but I think it is really important for us to kind of have our eyes open and see the wickedness for what it is, so that we can act with urgency on behalf of those that are being targeted by this ideology. So I think it's a great conversation. You're really going to enjoy it. But before we jump into that, I would like to welcome a new sponsor to the show. The Ezra Institute is a great Christian organization that seeks to equip Christians to engage the culture from a strong biblical worldview. And they have a great event for students coming up this summer. It is the Worldview Youth Academy. It's for students 14 to 18 years old, and is taking place July 12th through the 18th in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. It is a great event that will help equip them with a strong Christian foundation and empower them to be cultural leaders. It is age-specific content that is designed to address the serious and practical questions young adults are asking. I think it's going to be a great event. It's so important to really help prepare your kids. Don't, just, bury your heads and hope that they turn out all right. We really need to be equipping our kids for the challenges they're going to be facing as they go out into the world. And so the Ezra Institute has put together a great academy that will help do that, help equip your kids for that. So go to EzraInstitute.com. If you register now, you can get the early bird price of $50 off. Again, that's EzraInstitute.com, and be sure to tell them that you heard about this on The Great Awakening. All right. So with that, let's jump right into my conversation with Brandon. Thanks for joining me, Brandon.
Thank you, Josh. It's good to be here.
Well, I've wanted to have you on. You've done a lot of work reporting on the trans ideology and that whole movement, and particularly a lot of work kind of talking about the detransitioners, people who have made life altering decisions and have immense regrets, and not only that, but tons of physical complications that are irreversible. And so often I think we have, we can get lost in talking about the culture war, and it becomes just kind of like, political issues that, we forget that there's real people behind this. And you recently had a thread on Twitter that just really was kind of a gut punch, detailing a real story of someone you talked to. And so I wanted to have you on to just kind of help us put a face to these culture war issues and just help us, understand how these things are affecting real people.
Yeah. Well, I have been on this beat reporting on these issues for over 7 years now at the Christian Post. It has not been the only issue that I've focused my journalistic work on. I've reported on other things, but I started falling down the rabbit hole of this harrowing subject soon after I got started in 2016. And I learned about the experimental medicalization that was being carried out in children's hospitals and in clinics nationwide on struggling young people, some of them minors, some of them young adults. And I really started to report on it critically. The Christian Post did an article series that explored the issue at length in early 2017. And I started to hear from the families. And I started to hear from those who lived to regret undergoing blockers, hormones, surgery, that kind of thing. The thread that you mentioned the other day was someone that I had met a few years ago, but recently re-interviewed him again for an upcoming project. The Christian Post, I produced a multi-part uh, investigative documentary style podcast series called Generation Indoctrination Inside the Transgender Battle. And we're coming up on season 3. We're in production right now. We're working on it. And so I reached back out to him to tell his story on an episode that we will be doing specifically on detransitioners, their lawyers, and others who are advocating for them. And this poor young man, who, don't want to give too much away, it's out in the state of Oregon, was lured into an orchiectomy, which is a trans bottom surgery, as they are called, euphemistically. And it's just a very typical story, especially in the West Coast. It's all the hospitals and the medical systems ideologically captured by this horrific gender dogma. And with no exploration of his underlying mental health issues, he underwent a surgery. But worst of all, and this is probably what stuck out to you, it was a progressive church, a congregation that helped facilitate and contribute to his confusion. And don't want to give too much away because I hope people can listen to the series when it comes out in a few weeks. But he was basically how it was when he was undergoing the transition and identified himself as a female. He would be lavished with "you're so brave" kind of praise. But then when things took a turn for the worst, and of course, these drugs and surgeries don't actually help anything. In fact, they only damage the body further. All of a sudden, he was persona non grata. They went dark and even kind of made cruel and nasty, cutting, manipulative, nasty, snide comments behind his back. And it blew up their progressive narrative. And so all of a sudden, these people who were so supportive now don't know what to say to him. And it was a Pentecostal pastor that he had met that told him the truth, but was also patient and very caring and loving and compassionate with him as he was navigating his confusion. And he now is walking with the Lord. And so there is a redemptive story, but oh, what needless suffering. And so that thread, that 13 tweet thread that you referenced, was just kind of, as I'm mulling over this issue, reviewing transcripts to prepare for this podcast series, it just really gets my goat when I see churches participate in what I believe is a modern form of human sacrifice and horrific child abuse. Even though this guy was an adult when this happened, this is one of the worst medical scandals of all time. And to see people appropriate God and Jesus and the church into it just really gets me hot under the collar.
Yeah. I definitely want to come back to that, the church's role in that. But I feel like with a lot of these issues, we can sanitize it by euphemistically calling it bottom surgery. And viewer discretion advised. Can you detail what that actually is?
Yeah, well, there are a number of different quote unquote bottom surgeries. The main one that is performed on males, and I have seen in medical journals that these have been done on boys as young as 15, is called a vaginoplasty. And it's phalloplasty for females. But for vaginoplasties, what they do is they try to make a fake vagina in a boy's crotch, and they amputate the penis. They sometimes cut it in two, they sever it in two, and they try to invert it to make it look as though it's a female sex organ. And if there's not enough tissue, say if the young person has been on blockers and hormones, his genitals, his secondary sex characteristics have never developed enough. So they will use part of the peritoneum, abdominal lining, or some part of his bowels in order to make a fake vagina to make it look like the actual thing. And of course, you know, our sex organs are hooked up to our endocrine systems, and so it doesn't function as a normal female sex organ would, given the hormones in a female body and that kind of thing. And so oftentimes what happens is because it's used portion of the bowel, it sometimes carries fecal bacteria and smells terrible. It rots because of necrosis. And in fact, one such surgery actually went viral online several months ago when Elon Musk saw it, because it was a linchpin Dutch study that was a bunch of, this boy was 18, where they did this surgery on it. And this was in the medical journals that was sort of used to justify these surgeries on younger people. This was the linchpin study. And there were actually pictures of this boy's disfigured anatomy, and it went wrong and he died. Sepsis caused his organs to fail. Problems arose within 24 hours of the surgery, and all the infections spread throughout his body. And there were pictures of his mutilated genitalia. And so people got a very rude awakening. But that was done back in 2016, and the Dutch medical report managed to resurface. I think some very determined people on Twitter dug that up and spread it around. And Elon Musk was horrified, and so that's why it got such widespread attention. But these disfiguring surgeries are very gruesome. For females, there are other. I think there's also the metidioplasty, but the phalloplasty is where surgeons harvest a portion of the forearm or thigh to make a fake penis. Then they sew it on to her crotch area, and they're I think it's probably, of all of the surgeries, it's probably one of the worst. People have a grid for hysterectomies or mastectomies because sometimes women might actually need those surgeries if they have breast cancer or something wrong with their uterus. Now, I still think mastectomies and hysterectomies are unethical when they're done for transgender purposes, because they're completely healthy organs. It violates every single standard of medical ethics. But the phalloplasties are just Frankenstein. They literally harvest a portion of forearm flesh and roll it up into a tube, and then it doesn't fix the body. And so, I know of a young woman, her mother, and she's also going to be featured in my upcoming podcast series, where she's got another surgery coming up where I think they're going to cut the fake organ in half and reroute her urethra because of all of the complications that these things cause. The general public woke up to the horror of these surgeries because they saw Scott Nugent pull down her sleeve during Matt Walsh's famous documentary, What is a Woman? But I've known about that stuff for years, and finally people seem to be waking up to the fact that these are, and I am hesitant to use this analogy because it's a rule against ever comparing anything to Nazis, but Jewish readers tell me this looks like Dr. Mengele, and I agree. Experiments on vulnerable young people, children and adults, cutting perfectly healthy tissue off and then slapping it onto other parts of the body. And it's truly Frankenstein.
Do we have any sort of accurate data on how many of these surgeries are performed per year?
It's exploding. Data has become hard to come by, but very recently, the Journal of American Medical Association, JAMA Network Open, a couple months ago, reported that in the last several years, I think they had tripled on young people. And I crunched the numbers. And I think it was approximately over 1,200 per year on ages 18 and younger. So if you divide 1,200 by 261, which is annual business days, that means 4.6 people, 18 and younger, minors and 18-year-olds, are being surgically disfigured in pursuit of a lie every single weekday in this country. That doesn't count, I guess, 19 through 25, which is a big demographic. A lot of college-age girls are getting their breasts cut off. The American Society of Plastic Surgeons has been documenting this, and I think there was even a 15% increase in transgender surgeries in 2020 when a lot of medical facilities were locked down because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But there was an increase in that from 2000. There was 15% more that happened on females, I believe, in 2020 than there were in 2019. And I think it's either mastectomies or all gender surgeries, not quite sure. I would have to go back and look at the chart, but it was, talking about dividing by 261 annual business days again, I think it was 32.7 breast amputations per weekday in 2020.
Mm.
That to give you an idea of the scope. Between 2016 and 2017, again from the American Society of Plastic Surgeons, and this is also documented in Abigail Schreier's watershed book, Irreversible Damage, the number of gender surgeries on females quadrupled.
Mm.
We're seeing a very high number, and it's starting to affect even people I know well. People like to think, and the mass media, the corporate press likes to make it out like this is just so rare. It's not rare,
Mhm.
not rare at all. A whole generation is being devoured um, hormonally and surgically, and certainly ideologically. Planned Parenthood will pass out testosterone after a 30-minute telehealth call without even a diagnosis or a psychiatric or psychological evaluation. Um, we have an entire generation of young people being experimented on in the most grotesque fashion.
Mm. What are the primary channels for this, the spread of this ideology? Where are kids getting the idea that they're a different sex?
Schools are big, social media, schools and social media. Wherever there's Wi-Fi, this movement is after your kids. You think you're safe in rural Alabama or in Lubbock, Texas? No. You think your kids might be exposed to it if they live in the Bay Area or New York City? Yeah, they'll get more of it there, but this is everywhere. Sex ed curriculum, there's all sorts of insidious gender messages uh, in that where you would expect it. And sometimes some states and localities have opt-out clauses where parents can withdraw their kids from that kind of thing if they want. But then this other thing is gender is sometimes put into anti-bullying
Mm-hmm.
lessons, and so you can't opt out of that. And I've seen examples of gender questions being inserted into math problems and social studies. And so the gender ideologues are completely dedicated to indoctrinating your kids however they can. One dad that I know who's fighting for his son calls it, the phrase he uses is covering all the exits. There's nowhere you can go. You think you're going to be safe if you just withdraw your kids from public school, or you move to a more conservative area, or you I mean, they are everywhere. And so those are the big ones. This really does take off, especially among adolescent girls. At first, this first wave, like I said, I've been on this beat for 7 years, and so I've watched it change and modulate a little bit. But there was a 2018 study in PLOS ONE, the academic journal, by Lisa Littman, the rapid onset gender dysphoria, the cohort. The primary demographic was teenage girls. This gender confusion would break out in friends groups, in clusters, peer contagion. Cutting is spread this way. Other maladaptive coping mechanisms. Social contagions, peer contagion, internet fueled. Well, the same thing seemed to be happening with this. Well, now the numbers are, I've heard from other psychologists, evening out a little bit, and there are more and more young men being affected as well. But the contributing factors, vary a little bit. What the factors that influence men are different from those. The social contagion amongst girls, it doesn't spread quite in the same way, but it's a whole generation, men and women, boys and girls alike.
Mm-hmm.
Schools and social media are the big drivers of it.
Now, when did this phenomenon really start to ramp up?
Well, a scholar, senior fellow think tank guy that I know says it's a phase change. Everybody's like, how'd this all happen so fast? And he compares it to liquid water becoming ice, and people notice the change, but really it's been gestating within a lot of our institutions for many decades. The queer theorists and the humanities departments in our university systems, and all of this has been sort of operating and lurking stealthily behind the scenes. There was the Bill of Gender Rights in the late 90s with a bunch of transsexual, they were called, activists that put together this laundry list of things they wanted, and nobody really blew it off. But with the collapse of faith in this country and with the ideological capture of all of the cultural institutions, we've seen this explosion. The flashpoint, I would probably say, if there was one, in 2016, in the last year of the Obama presidency, I remember then Attorney General Loretta Lynch was sort of instituting this in the Justice Department about bathroom use and that kind of thing. There were that on the policy level, I remember that being people were just aghast, like, what in the world is this? But President Obama had some trans activists, a lot of them that were helpful to him, even in getting him into office with their billions of dollars. Um, the money that was behind a lot of that, he sort of got the ball rolling in some ways. But 2015 and 16 seemed to be a real shift. I mean, as soon as Obergefell that ruling came down, everything immediately pivoted to transgender activism. And 1 year later, I become a journalist at the Christian Post, and I see how language is being twisted in the media. And then I learn about the medicalization, that they were even doing this to children. And I realized I had some work cut out for me because it really was like falling down the rabbit hole. Because for me, I thought transgenderism was just transvestites at Mardi Gras and these kind of eccentric oddballs that live on the margins of society. Had no idea that this had become ideologically entrenched in the medical system and in the educational arena to the degree that it had.
Mm-hmm. Well, on the as this has been ramping up and exploding, as you say, we've also begun to see a rise in detransitioners, people who have undergone these surgeries and have regrets. Can you talk about what that is like?
Yeah, it's been good to see. I mean, the fact that people are willing to face the truth of what they either participated in or what was done to them. The big case that I think started to get the world's attention was in the UK with Kira Bell, who was transed chemically, hormonally at the Tavistock Clinic, and then went on to have her breasts amputated. And it was her testimony in the UK that ultimately led to the health system doing an independent review, and that famous gender clinic, the Tavistock Clinic, was ordered to close this year. And she kind of became the face of those who were transed as minors in the UK. But with the Tavistock closing down, the Tavistock Clinic has some storied histories of medical scandals. And so to see that symbolically is just big. Europe began backpedaling in light of some of the things that they were seeing. Sweden, Finland, France. I think I even saw the Italian Association of Psychologists not so long ago make a statement, and we're starting to see some walking back of this treatment protocol. But in the United States, it's been much harder going. But then we are seeing some. The New York Post did some profiles of detransitioners in 2022, and this year it's just been more and more of them going to state legislatures to testify, and that takes a lot of courage. Not only are they admitting to themselves that this was all a lie, that these drugs and surgeries irreparably harmed my body, they're saying they're actually willing to go out and stick their necks out and urge state legislative bodies to say, no, don't even allow this. And there's a number of them that have been kind of famous. Perhaps the most famous, Chloe Cole. She even testified in the National Congress in July about what was done to her. She was put on puberty blockers at 12, cross-sex hormones at 13, I believe, breasts amputated at 15, regretted it all at 16, and has kind of become the face of those who were trans as minors. And I have sympathy for anybody who underwent this experimental medicalization, because I don't believe it's ethical at all. But I think the American public feels very differently when you see people altering a child's body, because children can't consent. And I think that takes people's breath away when they realize that, okay, we know that the age of majority in a lot of states is 18 to consent to sex, but you're going to tell a child that they can give informed consent to the chemical foreclosure of their fertility, and they can wind up sterile, and they can cut their body parts off. Let's back this train up, please. And so that's what we're starting to see. But their stories are absolutely breathtaking, particularly when you realize the extent to which the machinery of the medical system and state entities, especially in blue states like California, are dead set against any opposition to transgender ideology. Families who oppose this are in a straitjacket. In fact, I know of a family right now where the daughter is, I think, living in another state, and it's functioning as though she is an orphan, has no parents, but all it really is that she claims that she's trans, and the state law allows her to live separately, enrolled in another school. And I think the parents get to see her grades, but that's about it. The state is smashing families. That's happening today in this country right now. Parents have lost custody. Children have wound up dead. I mean, the horror stories abound. We could talk for hours.
Hmm.
But the state laws and the institutional capture of all of relevant entities that have tremendous sway over how you raise your family are now increasingly in favor of this insanity. And in addition to the detransitioners, who I really hear from, I've lost count, are families at the end of their rope, fractured, battle scarred, at their utter wits' end because their children have been stolen by a cult and their bodies have been irreparably damaged. And there's not a single area of life that this doesn't bring ruinous corruption and destruction.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, there's not just let's just find a conservative enclave. I saw this week that the Biden administration is going to withhold school lunch funding from schools that refuse to go along with this. Yeah. It's just like everywhere is pushing this. There is no safe, safe place from it.
This is the religion of the cultural social left, and they will force everyone to worship at its altar.
Okay.
And I know left-wingers that are opposed to it, but that's the ideology that rules the day. LGBTQ dogma is the American state religion. And a lot of people still don't know that yet.
Yeah. Well, where you report for the Christian Post, where has the church been in this? Where is the church waking up? Is this something that we're responding to well?
Soon.
Yeah.
It really depends. I do hear from, I've been speaking in churches and some ministries related groups in recent months. The church's response largely has really disappointed me. And I think there are several reasons. One, it isn't as present in some conservative areas where, Christians tend to live. I mean, and so some of it's just a lack of awareness, or the issue is so bizarre that they can't get their head around it, or it's not, or because it's not as bad in their district, they just don't see the threat of it. And so some of it is just ignorance, and I don't blame them for that. But what I am seeing, unfortunately, is just a fear. There are pastors that just don't want to confront this for some reason. And I think part of it is hesitance because of how previous issues were handled in the LGBTQ arena. And so they are maybe rethinking how they approach it in a more I can't get inside the heads of every pastor, but it's a sort of a combination of things that contribute to a lot of inaction, when I'll tell you, a lot of atheists and agnostics and non-religious people who call me are begging churches to speak up and be bold, to the point where some of them say they are not even sure they believe in God, but they think they believe in demons because of the evil that this has unleashed in their families. And they know, I said this in my Twitter thread the other day, they know that woke church is a joke. That they don't like people. They roll their eyes when they see churches with a rainbow flag draped across their altar or their doors. It's like, yeah, like I think that they know it's a sick joke. Mm-hmm. So they come calling to the Christian Post. So I am proud of my publication for being ahead of the curve on this one. As disappointed as I am in some churches, we are determined to plant our flag on this hill and not budge an inch, because this is one of the worst medical scandals of all time, and it's a child abuse scourge. And we believe that if you distort and twist Genesis 1:27, which declares that we're made male and female in God's image, you've distorted the whole gospel. And so that isn't a secondary or a tertiary doctrinal matter for us. That's very primary. Mm-hmm. The gospel will have no meaning if we manipulate the human body like this, because our faith is about the redemption of the body. And so we're standing strong on it. But the other thing, I'm being kind of hard on pastors for not getting it or not confronting it, but gender ideology, and I write this in an ebook that I authored called Exposing the Gender Lie, free download on christianpost.com. The confusion is a feature, not a bug, of this dogma. A lot of people are legitimately confused because it is confusing and it's crazy making. What people say the word gaslighting is overused these days, but really what could be more crazy making than telling you that a man is really a woman, and that words have always had the opposite meaning than what they've always had. That alone is enough to drive you bonkers. I mean, that you're overtaking our very means of communication in order to institute a lie that human beings can change sex. So it takes a while to realize that it is as bad as we are saying, and probably worse. But I think once your eyes are open to it, and you don't have any excuse anymore, uh, courage is the only option, because it's devastating what's happening to so many people.
Yeah. For me, that, it's always been, I feel like the church has always maybe responded to some mistreatment of, homosexuals, back in the day. And so I think that a lot of Christians are very hesitant, very, they want to be loving and treat that community with love. And for me, this issue, I think we're taking that approach with the trans issue and loving people right into irreversible. Like, to me, there's an urgency with this issue that maybe, you can just pray for your loved one who, is living in a homosexual lifestyle. But if you've got a loved one that is pursuing this sort of these sort of procedures and has bought into this ideology, it's not the time for just like meek, let's smile and be nice and celebrate when they make, advancements in this. No, this is something that we have to step into.
Yes. It's a 5-alarm fire.
Mm-hmm.
And it is what's so insidious about this is that, and you see this to a certain degree with the other letters in the acronym, but there is a deliberate attempt to hijack and weaponize the compassion that many Christians innately have for ill-devised purposes. Mm-hmm. Oh, just try to understand. Like, there's this emotional appeal, and tender-hearted Christians fall for it. And, Josh, I don't know a single Christian who is a sincere follower of the Lord Jesus Christ who would not want to walk through a pastoral process with someone who's truly struggling and confused, whatever the issue, but especially with this. But as you say, it's the immediacy of the experimental medicalization that is just so dire, because, like I said, you can get hormones, cross-sex hormones, within half an hour of a telehealth call with no psychological evaluation, no diagnosis, and you're drugged immediately. And when you screw up your hormones, there's, I mean, you might be able to recover if you're not on them for very long, but you will start to see very physical changes, and every body responds to those drugs differently. So there's no, and then of course, if you cut off body parts, I mean, I know people who, within months of declaring themselves trans, were missing organs within months. And so there is an immediacy to it. Do not let your compassion be weaponized against you, and don't let that be used as a cudgel to abuse you from offering criticism or caution, because these harms are irreversible. And it's just so, and you know what's the irony of it all, Josh, is, like you, I'm very much a believer in historic Christian sexual ethics and marriage. That's what we stand on that at the Christian Post as well. But I know gays and lesbians who are fighting harder against this than a lot of pastors. Left-wing atheists, openly gay and lesbian people are resisting transgenderism. And there's often this kind of fight where, oh, well, they led to this, they helped. And it's like, okay, we can definitely talk about the philosophical progression over the decades of what contributed and what gave rise to all these other things. In the meantime, it's a 5-alarm fire. The whole house is on fire. Many children are inside. So I would start talking to people, grab a bucket of water and start hurling it, because that's how dangerous it is. Yeah.
Okay. So let's say you're, there's someone listening to this that this is the first time they're hearing this, their eyes are open. They want to get involved. What can churches, what can individual Christians do to really join this fight?
Okay. The first thing, I'm going to sound very much like a Pentecostal, as I have that in my background, but I love one of the scriptures that's been animating me so powerfully in these last couple of years, but especially in the last months, as I've been more have a public face on this and going out and speaking is 2 Corinthians 10, verse 4. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God for the tearing down and destruction of strongholds. I very much believe that if you've got intercessors at your church, this needs to be something they are taking before the throne of God every single day. I very much believe that aside from all of the activism and all of the political activities you might engage in, all of the social outreach or whatever it is that you want to do with your talents and skills, this will be dismantled in the realm of the spirit if the church prays. This is diabolical wickedness. And so if you have prayer meetings at your church, go after this thing in prayer and intercession, and pray Psalm 139 over your kids every single day. Declare that they are fearfully and wonderfully made. God knew them even before they were born. Pray the word over your children. That's your first responsibility, especially if you're a parent and you've got kids. They are being exposed to this. There are people out there who are trying to, I'm just going to say it, medically rape them. They are trying to cut their body parts off and rob them of their ability to have kids and horrifically damage their bodies. There are people that are that evil and that sadistic out there doing this. And a lot of people who are just have been ideologically swept up into believing that this is actually good. They are dreadfully deceived. And so pray your brains out that God supernaturally intervene, because that's what it's going to take. So I say that first. The other thing that I think that is so important for people to do at the school level is, and I say school level because I honestly think that that's where this medical scandal and this scourge begins. Gender clinics wouldn't have a clientele were it not for the ideological indoctrination that's taking place in schools. And so I know that a lot of school board members, especially in liberal areas, are totally drunk on the LGBT emphasis on T, but they're drunk on that Kool-Aid. Mm-hmm. And so it's like talking to a brick wall. But I would still say, as much as you can get this pseudoscience out of your kids' curriculum at school, that's a win, because we have no business teaching children that human beings, sexually dimorphic mammals, can change sex. It's an insane lie, but that's where it starts. That's the groundwork that is laid, where kids are then roped into these kinds of things. Don't let your kids go to any of these clubs, after school clubs. There's a lot of those places. Gay Straight Alliance, they used to be called. Now they're called Gender and Sexuality Alliance. So much damage happens there. Even if your kids have friends there and they want to go and be a part of it, but not themselves, no. Keep them as far away. You wouldn't let them go to a drug den. Keep them away from GSAs. Get this stuff out of the schools, because that's really where it starts. And so you'll have your work cut out for you if you do just that. There's plenty of other things that you might do if your area of interest is, contesting the medical aspect of this. And some people want to lobby for legislation in certain states if you have in a red state. But though I think about every state that has passed a ban, and I'm not here to endorse any kind of candidate or legislation as a journalist, just by the way, but especially if they're Christians and they're watching this, and you feel like the Lord is pricking your spirit to get involved in some way, the best advice I can give is just seek his face, and whatever you sense the Holy Spirit telling you, just walk in obedience to that and do it.
Yeah. And I would say,
pray over your kids, protect your kids
absolutely.
at all cost. Yeah.
I would say as individual Christians, I think we have been kind of conditioned into, in social settings, we kind of smile and go along. And when these types of topics come up, we just kind of like, try and change the subject. And I think we've got to
be brave.
We've got to be bold. Brave. Yep.
Boldness is what it's going to require. I mean, more supernatural courage than you've ever displayed, because you think this won't happen to you. Well, that's what every parent tells me when they call me desperate.
Yeah.
No one had a grid for this.
Yeah. Now, where do you see, we've talked about the church. What about the conservative movement? Because, it seems like there's kind of a trend within the conservative movement to embrace a lot of the sexual ideology. I think Fox News did a puff piece on a transitioning child at one point. Yeah. What is the state of the conservative movement with this?
I wrote an angry column about that Fox News puff piece. I, as a journalist, I see all kinds of things and so I'm very much conservative leaning myself and a small O Orthodox Christian, unapologetically so. I think that if you are a small O Orthodox evangelical Christian, philosophically conservative, but even if you're a socially conservative Democrat from the South, and those people exist, but you see these human person kind of sexual and gender issues as paramount, wherever you fall. This is, in my estimation, the issue of the day, again, because of its implications for the gospel. I came of age as a college student during the state level fights to uphold the definition of marriage as between a man and a woman. I was 20. I remember being in college and I saw all of these states trying to, you know, keep marriage intact, legally speaking. And I realized then that whatever ended up happening on the legal front, that this was fundamentally spiritual. And that I saw people trying to make this kind of separation in their mind. Well, let's just focus on the gospel, as though you could section these issues off from the gospel, like talking about Jesus Christ dying for your sins. It's like, and it means something to be human. Like this kind of disconnect that I saw some people trying to make, even if they would say they would disagree with all of the alphabet soup of, gender and sexual nomenclature and all that stuff. I saw this insidious separation, and to me, like, this absolutely is a gospel issue. I mean, I said it a moment ago. If you distort Genesis 1:27, you have distorted the entire biblical narrative. Marriage is the picture of Christ's covenantal love with the church. The Bible begins with a wedding in a garden. It concludes with marriage supper of the Lamb. Song of Solomon, erotic love is celebrated. Jesus begins his ministry at the wedding in Cana, performs his first miracle. It's the metaphor, it's the great interpreter to the whole capital S story. We get this wrong, we get the whole gospel wrong. And so if you believe what I just said, I think you need to bring those convictions to bear on who you vote for. And it doesn't matter if that kind of distortion is coming through the Republican Party, and it is increasing in some places, or the Democratic Party, which has basically kicked all their social conservatives out, except in the Deep South. And God bless them, and maybe pockets in the Midwest. But the social conservatives are going to have to be determined to not budge, because whatever happens politically, God doesn't mess around with this. Like, you don't, you're not going to inherit the kingdom of God if you're genuflecting before the spirit of the age on these things. This is a big deal. And I'm not willing to, it really irritates me when I see people just sort of hiding behind niceness, or, they just think that they can separate these things out, when no, it's not, because we wish to preside over a culture of shame, as has been done in some churches, and we got to own that. Okay. But these things matter because our bodies matter to God. Our body, the human body itself, I believe, is a declaration of the gospel, and it conveys its very physical structure as male and female conveys a moral message that we are obligated to respect. And so, if those of your convictions, stand on them, don't budge, and let them inform how you think about the world, and including who you vote for. And don't be willing to call it out, even if it's from someone that you like politically who does something. And we can talk about surrogacy. That seems to be the issue that a lot of conservatives are celebrating now, that people are finally getting a clue how wrong this is. But we're starting to see those things. You mentioned the Fox News bit. Don't bow to the spirit of the age, whether it comes through the Republican Party or the Democratic Party.
Yeah,
I think it's harder to do with people that you generally are inclined to like, because you might agree with them on other things. But these are things I know I won't compromise on.
Yeah. Well, let's go there, since you brought up surrogacy, and that has been in the news with I think Guy Benson announcing that they ordered a baby in his husband. But yeah. You see these as connected issues. Can you explain that?
I do. And let the record show, whether it's Guy Benson and the other guy, his other husband, or a heterosexual couple, I oppose all surrogacy, all of it, because it is the instrumentalization of the human body for a morally illicit act. It's the procurement of a human being as though it is a commodity to be bought and sold. And it also, I mean, the Vatican is totally against it, and Protestant sexual ethics, I think some of them some ethicists are starting to get it and agree with the Catholic Church on this. But it matters how human beings come into the world, and there are all kinds of health issues that happen that are apart from any kind of theological point that could be made. A surrogate pregnancy starts as a high-risk pregnancy, particularly if you are poaching the gametes from, say, the donor mothers. A couple different kinds of surrogacy, but if you hyperstimulate the ovaries of a woman to extract her egg and then inseminate that with the sperm, and then you place that in another woman to incubate for 9 months, the surrogate mother recognizes that woman as the mother. I mean, it's going to attach, and the mom is going to bond to that developing baby for 9 months, and then gives birth, and that maternal child bond is just severed right then and there. And there's a trauma that's created, and it's unlike adoption. People like to compare these things because adoption is trying to make good of a sad situation and trying to give a child who needs a mom and a dad a home, whereas surrogacy creates it from the get-go. You intentionally create a wound. It's a terrible practice. And then when you add the money factor in, it's, we don't think it's wrong to use a woman's body for sex, prostitution. Well, it's also wrong to use her body for reproduction. And people bring up this notion of consent. Well, if money's in the picture, is that real consent? But even if you do it altruistically and you just do it for free, it's still abusive to the body. A surrogate mother has no medical need to put herself at risk. And maybe she thinks she agrees to it because she just wants to do it. She has no idea what it's going to be like. I would very much commend to all of your listeners to check out the work of the Center for Bioethics and Culture. Jennifer Law is a friend of mine. She's a Lutheran bioethicist who's been doing tireless work in the trenches for years. As far as I'm concerned, she is the preeminent Christian expert on this topic. All of her work is brilliant. She's made several documentary films about it. Surrogacy is an unethical practice that should never be supported by Christians. And I say it's connected to the transgender thing because some of the same drugs that they give to surrogate women are the same drugs they give to Lupron. They give it to in these trans procedures. And the surrogacy industry is also connected to the transgender beast because if children are going on these blockers and hormones, they are sometimes offered fertility preservation. They'll freeze their gametes so that then later down the road, if they want to have kids, they will have to use a surrogate with their frozen gametes, even though, that's such a racket too, because I think very, very few people where like kids have had cancer and they've had to preserve their fertility to maybe use later. A minuscule number of births have resulted from that. So this idea that these kids who are foreclosing on their fertility and freezing their gametes so they can have a surrogate child later on in life. I mean, it's like we're living in a sci-fi movie.
Yeah.
And it's horrible. And it's not an ethical practice either.
Yeah. It's like Gattaca. Yeah. Showed that to my kids last year. And it's just like, it's
abusive to the body.
Yeah. And it's speaking to the difference between surrogacy and adoption. Katie Faust, who was a guest on my show last year, she says that adoption is adults sacrificing for the benefit of children. Right. And surrogacy is children sacrificing for the benefit of adults. And it's just completely different. But well, Brandon, I have appreciated this. This is hopefully eye-opening for some of my listeners, and it can be, I think is rightfully so. This is a heavy episode, and I hope people kind of sit in it. But so as to not leave people in a state of despair, what are some things that are giving you hope right now?
Well, I think that there are people waking up to just how bad it is. And I would commend to all of your viewers to familiarize themselves with the suffering of the families, because I think that is actually the key. People are talking about detransitioners in their testimonies, and they're so sad. But I think the family pain is really crucial at causing this long-awaited reckoning that I know many of us have been praying and crying out to God for for years. And to that end, I will very much commend to their viewing an indie documentary film that I'm in called Dead Name. You can go on deadnamedocumentary.com, and I make a brief appearance in that documentary film. I've done a lot of press this year about it. We've done some screenings of it. It moves audiences. It makes them understand how this pits children against their parents and parents against their children. It shows just how this smashes through family relationships and brings havoc and destruction and torment and chaos and misery in its wake. I won't give too much away, but one of the things I do say in my brief appearance in that movie is that it ruins everything it touches, and you see how this destroys families. It's getting in touch with the family pain that I think is crucial to waking up. And I'm seeing more and more people really wake up to how severe this is. And so go to deadnamedocumentary.com and give that a watch, because that'll really underline all of the issues we've discussed today in a very poignant manner. And the filmmaker's not even a religious person. Like, they're in the people, one of the parents profiled as Catholic and the others are not, but this is affecting all kinds of families. And so what gives me hope as well is that despite the horror of all of this, and it is like staring into the abyss, Josh, it's some of the worst suffering you've ever seen. It is demonic, it's ghoulish, it's unbelievably terrible. I'm seeing God even use the really evil things that are manifesting in this world and turning them around for good. And that really, at the end of the day, you either believe, I've been reading through Romans lately in my quiet time, Romans 8:28, he really does work all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And he can even use the transgender scourge for his glory. And that's what continued to give me hope. And so Christians, you really need to be there for your friends and your neighbors, because I think many of them, especially if they've been fractured by this, and there are thousands upon thousands of families like that across this country, I think you're in a position to really help some people.
Yeah, it's
not be a comfort.
Yeah, it's not
people are looking for help.
It's not this issue or the gospel. It's let's bring the gospel to this issue. So yeah,
absolutely. Infuse it with and just pray. If I can emphasize anything, it's just pray. I do believe, I'll conclude on a hopeful note too. A couple of years ago, I was praying with some intercessors. It was actually about Thanksgiving 2021. And I sensed that, I'm going to sound like a Pentecostal again, but I sensed that still small voice of the Holy Spirit say to me that the wicked will soon be dethroned. Those who are doing this, these modern day Amorites that their iniquity is about to reach its full measure if it hasn't already. And so in the meantime, just keep your eyes on the Lord, keep praying, and be a part of the reckoning when it comes, because there's a lot of people who are going to need a lot of help to recover from what has done. There's probably going to be books and PhD theses written about this for years, what has been allowed to happen and erupt in our society because of a ruthless commitment to an insane dogma. But Christians, you got to stand up.
Yep. Well, thank you so much, Brandon. I appreciate the work you're doing on this. Where can people find some of that work?
ChristianPost.com. Of course, you find print reporting. I write some columns there. GenerationIndoctrination.com, or wherever you get your podcasts, on Spotify. Stay tuned for season 3. It should be out in the next couple of late December and early January. That should be out. We've got a rock star cast. My other colleagues at Christian Post do great reporting as well. The Exposing the Gender Lie ebook is also on ChristianPost.com. And as I mentioned, please go to deadnamedocumentary.com and check that film out, because that'll really drive it home.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brandon.
Thank you, Josh.
That's our show for today. Big thanks to Brandon Showalter for joining me for this conversation. I'll have links in the show notes where you can find more of his work. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Ratings and reviews over at Apple Podcasts are always appreciated. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure and hit like and subscribe so you don't miss future content. I'll be back soon. And until then, I will talk to you soon.